Hi everybody, welcome again to the NYC Women's Fund for Media, Music, and Theater info session. Today we're going over the media category. So the NYC Women's Fund applications had opened Monday, July 26th. Applications will close November 1st at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Applicants will be notified during March of 2022. And all application forms can be available on the NYFA website at the NYC Women's Fund main grant page. So this presentation, we're going to be going over an overview of the media category. This will include eligibility criteria, going over the application form, which will be an overview of the application, work samples, and the budget. We'll also leave time for Q&A at the end. So for any questions that you may have, please, as Judy mentioned, drop them in the chat and we'll be answering them at the end of the session. So going over the categories for media, applicants can apply in one of the following categories. And just a note that applicants are only able to apply in one of the categories for the entire NYC Women's Fund. So the categories are fiction feature, which would be a running time of 60 minutes or more, and the maximum amount for this grant would be $50,000. Fiction short, this is something with a running time of 59 minutes or less, and the maximum amount for this grant is $25,000. Fiction webisode or web series, maximum for this grant would be $20,000. Documentary feature, running time of 60 minutes or more at $50,000 as the maximum. Documentary short, running time of 59 minutes or less with the maximum grant amount of $25,000. And finally, documentary web series or webisode, and that would be the maximum amount is $20,000. So going over now the eligible project types. So for media, the NYC Women's Fund provides finishing grants to support media projects in film, television, and digital. So finishing grants, essentially, to be eligible, projects need to have completed principal photography. Just for context, principal photography is essentially the production stage of a media project where filming occurs. So only projects that have wrapped filming and are entering post-production will be considered for this grant. So going over some eligibility criteria. In addition to being made by, for, or about all who identify as women, projects are eligible if they feature any of the following: a strong female perspective, or include a meaningful female or female identified producer credit, writing credit, or protagonist, or protagonist. The applicant must reside in any of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Applicants do not need to be US citizens, but must be able to provide a W-9 with a social security number or individual taxpayer identification number or EIN after selection, and that's just for direct deposit. So continue with eligibility criteria. Projects must have wrapped principal photography and must be able to submit a timeline that outlines final cut and distribution that meets program deadline of March 31st, 2023. Eligible projects can be live action or animated. The applicant can be either the filmmaker or a producer. All recipients must complete a final report clearly outlining how the NYC Women's Fund was used to complete the project, along with sharing information on attendance numbers and public access plans or outcomes. So the final report would be after receiving the grant. Funds must be used to complete the project outlined in the application form. Funds may be allocated as the applicant needs to complete the project. However, funds cannot be used to purchase capital goods. This is like equipment, computers, etc. So the project must follow at least one of the two criteria, which is 75% of its total shooting days take place in New York City, or 75% of its production costs are qualified production costs. So qualified production costs means below the line production costs only to the extent such that costs are incurred directly in New York City and are attributable to the use of tangible property or the performance of services within New York City directly and predominantly in the production, including pre-production and post-production of a qualified film. So keeping in mind that these are finishing funds, it's important to think about this as 75% of your post-production and 75% of your post-production costs should be in New York City. With any specific questions regarding this criteria, you can feel free to email me at nycwomen'sfund@nyfa.org. Moving to the application form. So the first part of the application form will ask for applicant information. The applicant, or if different, the recipient of funds must be a current resident of New York City. Applicants will be asked to provide an NYC residential address, contact information such as a phone and email, and the names and contact information for directors, writers, producers, etc. For your project, you will be asked to provide the following: the project name and running time, project synopsis. This will be a narrative that goes over an overview of the themes and potentially overall storyline of your project, how your project represents voices, experiences, and perspectives of all who identify as women, production schedules and plans to complete by March 2023. This can include a narrative or calendar of events and key milestones, where your post-production will take place. In this narrative, you will want to provide a general sense of the locations for your project's key post-production facilities, but keep in mind that we don't need a list of addresses for every location or studio used. Finally, plans for promotion and distribution. In this, please tell us what platforms the piece or series will appear, who your target audience is, and what your plans to reach and engage them are. We understand that plans are tentative unless otherwise stated. So continuing with project information, you'll want to include the total dollar amount which you are requesting for your project, how you plan to spend the NYC Women's Fund Award. So this can be an itemized list, and keep in mind that no more than 20% of the request can be used for marketing, festival fees, distribution costs, etc. You'll also be asked to upload brief biographies of the applicant, performers, producer, and any other key participating artists. For this, please combine all biographies into one PDF document, no larger than 10 megabytes. Each individual biography should not exceed 1 page. So now to go over the work samples. The work samples do differ between feature and the short and web series categories. So for documentary or fiction feature categories, the work samples are the following. Applicants should include 2 work samples from the project for which they are seeking support, 1 short clip, which is up to 10 minutes in length, and 1 longer sample between 45 to 60 minutes. This longer sample should give a sense of the overall scope and trajectory of the film. For documentary or fiction short and web series categories, applicants should include 2 work samples from the project for which they are seeking support, 1 short clip of up to 5 minutes in length, and 1 longer sample of up to 40 minutes, which includes which gives an overall scope and trajectory of the series or short. Please note that for the longer work sample, there is a maximum of 40 minutes, but there isn't necessarily a minimum. The longer sample is just there to give the panel, the reviewers, a better idea of the scope of the work. So there's no need for the short or the web series to be 40 minutes in length. The longer sample is just meant to give an idea of what the work is about. Next are some tips for submitting your work samples. One of the most important, of course, is that uploading video files can take more time than expected, and please do not leave uploading your work samples to the last minute. Once you know what work sample excerpts you will be submitting, you can upload them directly to the application form in Submittable. You can always save and close your application form to go back to it later, at a later date. Noting also that there will be a comment section to provide context for the clips if you desire. Submitting video samples comprised of multiple clips from different projects is also not recommended. So things like sizzle reels or trailers should be avoided for the work samples in general. And titles and credits should not be included in the excerpts. When editing your video, it's important to ensure that your file is formatted correctly so that your video will play across a range of platforms while maintaining quality. Therefore, it is important to choose the right codec and container for your file. A video codec is a method for encoding and decoding data and is used for compressing data, particularly video. Choosing the right container can depend on several desired outcomes: file size, playback quality, capabilities for re-editing, etc. There are many to choose from, but we would recommend using H.264, which is the preferred format, especially for Submittable. A container is typically associated with the file format, and what is used to contain and package the data is compressed by the codec. The container is indicated by a file extension such as .mov or .mp4. And as I mentioned, the H.264 codec and .mp4 container are the preferred methods, as they're supported by a wide range of media players with little loss of quality. I'll also share that for Submittable, I think that we've had the best outcomes with these formats. So moving on to the budget, there is a budget table directly in Submittable, which you'll be asked to complete for your proposed project. Please note, applicants do not need to complete all budget lines. Artist fees should include all related expenses, including union fees. So for example, if you're paying an artist a salary as well as covering their union fees, you'll want to combine those into one line item for that artist. Please add unlisted budget items under Other for each category and explain these expenses in the budget notes section. Subtotals and project totals will update automatically on the budget table in Submittable. So here is an example of what the budget table looks like. You can see on the left is a description of all the line items, keeping in mind that you don't need to fill out all of these budget lines. Next, you'll see total expense. That's the total expense for your project. Next is the NYC Women's Fund allocation. So this is the amount of the fund, of the grant that you would allocate towards these budget lines, if any. In-kind refers to any donated or in-kind expenses. And spend to date is the amount that you've spent so far. And keeping in mind that your total expense should be the New York City Women's Fund, in-kind, and spend-to-date columns added together. That's how you get your total. So that's the end of the application. The next few questions, there will be, NYFA asks all grant applicants to complete a demographic questionnaire. These answers are not part of the application, and your responses will remain anonymous and will not be linked to your identity. And for assistance in applying, NYFA is committed to supporting artists from every background and at all stages in their creative careers. We strongly encourage artists of color, LGBTQ+ artists, and artists with disabilities to apply. To request an accommodation, or if you need specific assistance in applying online, please email nycwomen'sfund@nyfa.org. That's nyfa.org. We ask that requests for accommodations be made as soon as possible and no later than Monday, October 18th, to allow adequate time for staff to support you in submitting an application before the deadline. So before you begin your application, all of the application questions, FAQs, and guidelines can be downloaded from NYFA's website. You can find and download the PDF guidelines specific to the media categories on the main landing page of the grant, or you can email nycwomen'sfund@nyfa.org to request a copy. So that concludes the presentation. I'm going to be moving on to some of your questions now. So some questions are, can a webisode be a single documentary on the web? I think yes. Yes, so if it's a single documentary episode for this, then I think yes. Not exactly sure what the difference between that and a short would be, but if it does end up being a series, then I guess that would be more applicable for a webisode. Does all filming have to be finished by November 1st or by March 2022? This is a great question. All filming should be finished by November 1st, which is the application deadline. That's just referring to principal photography. So if there are like some pickup shots or anything like that, that can be acceptable after the November 1st deadline, but your principal photography should be completed by November 1st or by the time that you apply. Can the applicant be an NYC nonprofit? Yes, I think that is possible, but there should be one individual who is the contact person for that project, which ideally would be the director of the project, of the media project, or the producer. If someone is a resident in NYC but will film the film somewhere else, this is also eligible as long as your post-production occurs in NYC. So if your principal photography occurs somewhere outside of New York City, that's still eligible if your post-production and the artist, like the main 75% of your budget will be spent in New York City. And that goes for films that are shot abroad. If NYFA chooses to fund a project, do you always give the amount requested, or might you just give part? It's possible that the panel reviewers will decide to give a part of the requested amount. That's sort of up to their discretion and taking a look at your budget. So I would just recommend to be realistic in your request, knowing that it could be less. I have 2 projects that each belong to different categories. Is it okay to apply for both projects? The answer for that is no. There is only 1 applicant per project per category. If we do see that you've applied for multiple categories, we'll email you and ask that you delete one of the applications. So it's best that you take some time and think about which one you would like to apply with and just apply for one. And that goes for all the categories, not just the media categories, but also theater and music as well. Can we still include production costs in the budget even if we finished production? So if this is for the New York City Women's Fund allocation, then yes, in a way, your principal photography should have finished. But if there are a couple of production costs, it is acceptable to include them. It does make sense to put them in your total expenses and your spend to date. But I'll also note that importantly, the NYC Women's Fund cannot be used retroactively. So if you do receive the grant and go back to reimburse artists that were involved in production, that would not be an eligible expense. So what area is the most and least important of the application? For example, is your distribution plan as important as the synopsis? This is going to be a question that's mostly up to the panel reviewers to decide. There isn't necessarily a most and least important part of the application, but for example, with your distribution plan, we do recognize that that's tentative. So whereas your synopsis is going to be a little bit more firm, especially given that your principal photography will have completed. So I hope that that gives a little bit of context, but yeah, there's not necessarily a least and most important part of the application. If you're editing the film yourself, but hiring out for sound and color, can I apply for my own editing fee or just sound and color? You can apply for your own editing fee, and we do encourage applicants to include themselves in their budget for the NYC Women's Fund allocation if they're going to be working on the project. And just as a tip, you can just include what your normal rate would be if you were charging somebody else for your services. So yes, you can apply for your own editing fee. Can the longer work sample be a script? No. For the media category, we're only accepting video samples. For the doc short 5-minute sample, so the shorter sample, is it better to show clips from different parts of the project, or do you prefer one 5-minute segment of the project? We would prefer one 5-minute segment of the project for the shorter sample. In general, it's not advised to edit the work samples to include multiple clips, essentially like a trailer or a sizzle reel. The panel just prefers to have the one segment uninterrupted. Are both the short clip and the longer clip required to upload? And what if for short or for fiction short, there may not be a longer clip? So it is a requirement that there be 2 work samples. One can be shorter, one can be longer. For the longer clip, we're looking for mainly a work sample that shows the scope of the work. If there is not a longer clip, so I guess I'll backtrack and say the short clip and the long clip don't necessarily need to be like 5 minutes and 40 minutes. The longer clip, there's no necessarily minimum time frame for how long the clip should be, but it should show the scope of the work. And for the longer clip, I do believe you're able to upload a link to the work instead of uploading it directly as a full file. I hope that answers your question. And if you have specific questions about your project, you can always email me at nycwomensfund@nyfa.org. So the next question, can you request funds to pay yourself for the editing and post-production through your own film company? Yes, you can pay yourself. Do you prefer to fund projects that have had in-kind funding or actual cash funding, or does it not matter? For our purposes, it doesn't necessarily matter that you have in-kind or actual cash funding. For us, it's more important to see that your budget is realistic and that it's there's a high probability that the project will complete, not necessarily any stipulations for what kind of funding you have. Can we submit a first rough cut of the project for the longer work sample? Yes. What are you looking for in the distribution plan for the projects that you choose? So for the distribution plan, we're mainly looking at what channels or what avenues you plan to release the project. So if that's through a distribution company, through film festivals, through online streaming, etc., you want to let us know what you're planning on for that. We'll also want to know your target audience and how you plan to reach them. Can you go through the differences in categories? Yes, so for fiction, essentially that's going to be something with a script, something that's a more or less a narrative. Documentary, that's something that's pulling from real life, essentially, not necessarily having a script, not necessarily having actors. There's 3 lengths, so that's feature, short, and webisode or web series. Feature, that's anything that's over 60 minutes in length. Short, that's anything under 59 minutes in length. And web series, there's not necessarily a length in time or even a number of episodes, but we do want you to specify. So for example, if you have a web series that has 10 episodes, but you've completed principal photography on 5, and you would like to apply to the grant with those 5 episodes, you want to specify how many episodes, the length of each episode, and et cetera for that. So for web series, it's important for us to know how many episodes will be counted towards the grant. It won't necessarily be like all the episodes that you're planning for the series for the duration of the series, if that makes sense. Will you be discussing the portions of the program devoted to funds for the creation of music, recordings, or videos? Not today. For music recording and video, that's going to be under the music categories of the NYC Women's Fund. We did do an info session on that a couple weeks ago, which can be found on either NYFA's YouTube page or on the main landing page of the grant under info sessions. So feel free to review that info session. And if you have additional questions, please let me know via email. And that's nycwomensfund@nyfa.org. In addition to the budget table and submittable, can we upload a copy of a more detailed working budget, or do you prefer only using the budget table provided? Yes, you may include upload of a more detailed working budget, but you must also fill out the budget table. Can digital content have an educational component? For the most part, yes. If there's something specific with this question, please feel free to email me. For all media grants for films that have already been shot, not for a film idea that is not. Okay, so I think the question is, can you fund a film that's in essentially in the idea stage or the pre-production stage where principal photography has not started? The answer is no, and the reason for this is that it's for the NYC Women's Fund, it is a finishing grant for media. It's meant for projects that have finished filming and just need funds to cross that finish line and get wrapped up completely. So for this specific opportunity, projects that have not completed shooting will not be eligible, unfortunately. Can an organization apply through a fiscal sponsor? I think that this question, yes and no. It kind of depends on who the lead applicant is. If you do have a question similar to this, please email me and I'm happy to review the specific scenario. So does key artist include the camera operators and editors or only the show writers? I think for key artists, it's kind of up to you, but it would mainly be the writers, directors, producers. It can include actors, it can include camera operators, especially if they're going to be integral to the project. So I'm assuming that this means for the biographies. So if you do want to include those members of your creative team, feel free to do so. For theater production, the question is, do we submit a script? Yes, that's the answer, but this specific info session is for media projects only. We will be holding a theater production or a theater category info session specific for these questions in about 2 weeks' time. So please look out for that. What category would a television pilot go in? A television pilot, I would, well, if it's for broadcast, I think that's maybe a separate question that we could go over individually. If it may be streaming online, then it would go under the Webisode category. So for the feature sample, the question is, if we're looking for post-production funds, how would a project include a 45-minute sample since the project would be just entering that phase? I think for this, if it's possible to have a longer sample that shows the scope of the work, please do so. If you're having trouble reaching that 45-minute mark, please do email me separately. We'd be happy to go over that individually. But of course, keeping in mind, like with this being a finishing fund, we are expecting like rough samples, but we're expecting to see something that would show the scope of the work. I hope that helps. If I execute multiple roles, can I submit for each role in the budget? Yes. So if you are, for example, the writer and the director, you can list yourself for both of those roles in the budget. How many times can one person apply for this funding? This depends on what you mean by this question. If it's for this cycle, one person can apply one time in one category. So for this year, if you have multiple projects, please select one project to apply in one category. Otherwise, we will email you and ask you to delete your application if you have submitted to multiple categories. However, if you have applied before in the past, you are eligible to apply again. If you have received this award in the past, you are eligible to apply again. However, you will need to have completed your originally funded work. So if you've received this award for a project in a past cycle, you can apply again once you've finished the project that you were originally funded for. So this question is, would a festival screening or public screening of a sample prior to, I guess, applying, would this affect eligibility? I think the answer for this is no, especially I think this question is specifically in regards to web series. So if you have screened, for example, like one episode of the series before, That does not take away eligibility if you are applying for new episodes. So you cannot apply, for example, if you've completed post-production on one episode or one project, you cannot apply for new funds to retroactively support that episode, but you can apply for new funds for new episodes in the series. Are there specific specifications on the kind or quality of camera used? For example, would a DSLR film shot in 1080p be acceptable? There are no specific specifications of the kind or quality of camera used, and it can be film or digital. So a DSLR would be acceptable. I have an NYC residential address, but I go to school somewhere else in New York City. My work was shot in New York City. Also, will this be a problem? And will this be a problem? So the answer is no. If you're New York City based, but you do go to school elsewhere, that should be fine as long as your work, as long as your post-production occurs in New York City. So it also doesn't necessarily matter where your work was shot as long as the post-production occurs in New York City. What do you expect from the distribution plan? I think we went over this already, but mainly just looking for what avenues you plan to release your project with, whether that's streaming, festivals, through a distribution company, theatrically, etc. Who your target audience is, and how you plan to reach them. The next question is, how long of a bio are you looking for, and what are you looking for in the bio? So this is for the applicant and key participating artists. For the biographies, it should be no longer than a page for each person. We're mainly looking for just a little bit of background, what your experiences are. There's nothing necessarily specific, but a little bit of background about you, your involvement and your role in the project, and your name. So just a brief biography. Are we still eligible if we've done crowdfunding for post-production? Yes, you're still eligible if you've done crowdfunding for post-production. It's fine to have multiple sources of funding. If the producer is female, the director is male, is it still eligible for funding? The answer for this is yes, if the project reflects a strong female or female identifying perspective. It's potentially best if the producer does apply for this, if the producer is female, the director is male, but that again is also up to you as the applicant. Any person of any gender is eligible to apply for the project as long as the project itself features either meaningful producer, writer, director credits for female identifying artists, female identifying protagonists, and or a strong female perspective. Can several people apply for one project? Yes, in the sense that teams or production companies may apply. However, there should be one lead applicant. So we understand that for media projects, there's likely a team of people working on the project. And in that case, you want to list your key participating artists. However, there should just be one point of contact, one lead applicant. And that lead applicant should be a resident of New York City. Can I apply if this is my first work as a producer, director, and editor? Yes, that's 100% okay. As long as you just make sure that the application is reasonable, feasible. There's no requirement for this to be only for experienced artists. So here's a question. What if you are based in 2 different locations, one in New York City and one in another part of New York State? So I'm guessing that this is one applicant who splits their time between New York City and New York State, somewhere else in New York State. You should still be eligible as long as you have at least a New York City residential address. So if that's, one of your addresses is in New York City, that's fine. And 75% of your post-production costs should be spent in New York City because the principal place of production for this grant is New York City. I also received a question to go over the budget lines again. So see if I can go back. So this screenshot is just an example of what the budget looks like in Submittable. This is a budget table. Essentially, you're able to put in your expenses under each budget line and enter this in directly into Submittable. On the left column, you'll see a description of potential budget lines, keeping in mind that you do not need to fill everything out for every budget line. So for example, if you're not including a grip or sound recordist in your project, there's no need to fill those budget lines out. You can just leave them blank. Next, you'll see total expense. For total expense, that's the full amount in which your project, that's the full budget for your project. So total expense essentially is going to be, so for, let me backtrack. So for the next column, NYC Women's Fund allocation, that is going to be the amount of the grant in which you're requesting in each budget line, if applicable. So for example, if you plan to use $10,000 of the grant towards your producer, then you would put that under this column. The next column is in-kind or donated expenses. So that's anything that's been donated to your project. That would be in the third column. Spend to date is the total amount which you've spent on the project so far. That can be from any funding source. Keeping in mind, so these 3 columns, the NYC Women's Fund allocation, in-kind, and spend to date are going to be the total, or the addition of these 3 columns is going to be your total expense. So your total expense should encompass these 3 columns. That's how you reach your total for the project. So that's the budget. Let's see if you have other questions. So since you have emphasized the post-production place a lot, I would just want to double check, what if the filming has taken place in New York City, but the post-production will be finished in some other country? Will that be eligible? The answer for this is no. And the reason for it is that the principal place production should be New York City. And because this is a finishing fund for media, the funds will be going mainly towards post-production, and post-production should mainly be in New York City. That doesn't mean that 100% of post-production needs to be in New York City, but for the most part, 75% of your post-production costs should be spent in New York City. So I don't want to say that it's necessarily impossible for you to finish your film in another country. If you're using NYC-based artists for this, and you're only paying those artists, then that would be eligible, but it would be very difficult for the budget to be eligible if you're spending most of your costs in another country. So unfortunately, I think it would be my best advice to, if you're applying for this fund, to have your post-production facilities be in New York City. Is an online subscription platform such as Patreon eligible under Webisode for online streaming distribution? I think that yes, an online subscription platform for streaming is eligible. Typically, we see artists saying things like Netflix or Hulu for this. For Patreon, it's a little bit different. I think you would want to specify who your target audience is. I'm guessing that would be your Patreon subscribers or supporters. So as long as you're very, very specific about who your target audience is and why Patreon would be your avenue, I think that would be acceptable, but again, up to the panel discretion on whether or not they would want to fund that project. So another budget question. I'm confused by the sample budget. A lot of the roles listed are for production positions instead of post-production positions. So the sample budget included in this presentation is taken from Submittable, and that's just essentially like the first part of the budget. If you do scroll down, you'll see, so this is the subtotal for production. If you scroll down, you will see sections for post-production and sections for distribution. The reason that there's production expenses on here is that it is possible to have some production expenses included in your project, and so that's why we have them on there. But keeping in mind, because principal photography must be completed for this project, it's more likely than not that most of your New York City Women's Fund allocation will be in the post-production part of the budget. I'll also note that we are asking for total expense in kind, or sorry, for in kind and spend to date, which will be included in your total expense. For this, you will want to submit information for the production phase, but it's just likely that your NYC Women's Fund allocation is probably going to be spent mostly in the post-production part of the budget. Hope that makes sense. I'll also, as a quick reminder, no more than 20% of the requested grant amount should be spent towards marketing and distribution. So for the distribution part of the budget, you still want to list your in-kind and spend-to-date expenses as part of your total expense. But for the New York City Women's Fund allocation, that cannot be more than 20% of the total requested funds. So just to clarify, could the grant be used retroactively to pay artists that were responsible for principal photography, not just for post? No, the grant cannot be used retroactively to pay for any expenses that occur before receiving the grant. So unfortunately, you will not be able to retroactively pay your artists for production. With the budget, it's not necessarily asking you for your NYC Women's Fund allocation to be spent on production costs. It's mainly asking for your in-kind and spend to date, but keeping in mind that there may be a few production costs that you'll want to budget for, even after finishing principal photography, such as pickups or anything like that. In that case, you can allocate the funds, but you will not be able to spend the funds retroactively. I hope that makes sense. I know it's a little bit confusing. Again, with budget questions too, for your specific project, do feel free to email NYC Women's Fund at nyfa.org for those questions. Can we use post-production funds to pay designers, such as lighting or costume design? Yes, if that's for post-production. I think if those designers have been used or have already submitted their services and the funds would be used retroactively, then that answer is no. But for like artistic personnel in general, for your creative team, you are allowed to pay any person that's been involved in the project. For this question, again, I think maybe we could go over this separately via email. For the NYC Women's Fund allocation column, we wouldn't allocate it towards production costs. I think this question is just to clarify the production costs for the budget. For the New York City Women's Fund allocation, I'll say this. The funds cannot be used retroactively and your principal photography must be completed. If there's production costs that may occur, essentially in real time after you've received the grant, then you can allocate those to certain production costs, but you will not be able to use them retroactively. And it's not necessarily, so I guess what I'm saying is it's not necessarily prohibited to include production costs in your New York City Women's Fund allocation, but keeping in mind that most of them should be in post-production. I think that's all the questions that we have so far. We're nearing the end of the presentation. If anybody does have a couple of last-minute questions, feel free to submit them. So does this mean that we will have to hold post-production until we get the grant results? For example, no editing can happen before March 2022 if we want to allocate NYFA funds. This will have to be at the discretion of you and your team. The answer is not necessarily. However, if you do plan on using the funds for those costs, I hesitate to advise you to do that because, again, this is a very competitive program. There's no guarantee that you'll receive the funds. So for this, I don't want to say that you'll need to host funds, but I will say that you cannot use the funds retroactively. Sorry to not have a more specific answer for that. But yeah, just keeping in mind with your project deadline, what works best for your project. Know that you've applied for the fund and it's a possibility, but it's not a guarantee that you'll receive the funds. So that concludes the presentation. Again, my email is nycwomensfund@nyfa.org. I want to thank you everyone for joining this presentation, for all of your questions. If you have more questions, please feel free to email me. And thank you and good luck in your application.